Hi everybody. So I wanted to do a brief video responding to your comments on the discussion thread and just tell you a little bit more about Beethoven Hero because my impression is that I don't know, I just think a summary video can be helpful sometimes. We're not going to stop talking about it necessarily, so um, I think it could be good for us to just go over a few things. My ring light is kind of making an appearance and my glasses making me look evil. Ooh. So, I wanted to tell you first why I assigned this. And why I've assigned the readings that I've assigned this semester, in addition to just sort of reviewing basic concepts of form and things like, um, you know, harmonies that you just haven't worked with in a while, or part writing rules and stuff like that. Like, we're going to get to those topics for sure. But I wanted to do a couple of readings because I want to have this class be an opportunity for you to transition your thinking toward graduate school type theory thinking and less like undergraduate theory thinking. I want you to start thinking about music theory more in this kind of mature, research oriented way, even as you review some of these concepts. So that's part of why I've assigned a few of these things. You know, when you're an undergrad, we don't really spend time going over things like the historical or cultural context for sonata form because there's so much to get through that a lot of times we have a tendency to just sort of plow through it and just make sure that you know the concepts and then call it a day. But I wanted you to see this article or this book chapter because I think it does a good job of explaining like that sonata form didn't just fall from the sky. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like it's definitely something that that developed over time and was shaped by the context of the people who were writing about it. And so this chapter is the third chapter in Beethoven Hero, and Beethoven Hero takes that same cultural kind of historical context approach to Beethoven in general, not just sonata form. Although this chapter is really oriented toward how music theorists helped cement Beethoven's reputation and shape the way that we think about his music. So that's part of why I assigned it also, because it gives you a sense of like, oh, music theory, like doing something besides just teaching you how to analyze a chord. That it really, music theorists really helped create the version of Beethoven that we think of today as like Beethoven. And a couple of you asked in your responses like why Beethoven, why not somebody else? And that's a really interesting question, and I think it's definitely worth asking. I'm not sure that I can just quickly answer it for you, but you know, he, in some ways, yes, he did do innovative things, and I don't want to discount that. Like, I like his music, and that's part of why I've assigned it. But also, the way that his music was received and discussed by people like these theorists shows that they were assigning kinds of meaning to it that go way beyond just sonata form. They really had a way of talking about it as in ways that sort of fit in with their own cultural expectations and practices. So I'll just briefly touch on a couple of the, or maybe each of the theorists from the article. He starts with A.B. Marx, and A.B. Marx's thing to remember is this idea that form is really determined by a state of rest and a state of motion and a state of rest. And I know that each of the theorists presented a little bit of kind of jargon that you probably weren't familiar with. I know some of you were like, what's a Hauptsatz? I've never thought about that before. But the important thing is that they had like this vocabulary that they developed to talk about these things. A Satz being like a phrase, and a Gong being a smaller phrase with motion. So with Marx, form is really a dynamic concept, and it's about that motion. And some of you responded and said like, that's how I think about form too. Like, it's not these static structures and the form charts like the one that I made you create on the last video, but it's more like musical form is being experienced over time in a dynamic way. He talks about Hugo Riemann, and Riemann had a spatial kind of conception of how musical form worked and how harmony works as well. And so there's actually people who have kind of revived some of those aspects of his theory. There's a dog who has just visited me. Hello. So that's what I'm doing over here is I'm petting the dog. Riemann, his theories have been kind of reconceptualized in the last like few decades to be used in a new way, because it's a way of sort of, you could make like a 3D diagram of a harmonic progression, for example, and like there's some interesting kind of visual potential for how to analyze music in like 3D space as opposed to just like marking on a score. And anyway, so Riemann is a really influential music theorist in the 19th century, and that's part of why he shows up in this chapter. And then Schenker is someone who we'll probably end up coming back to a little bit. He's just he looms so large that he shows up in a lot of different stuff that I assign. Now, you might also have heard of Schenker if you're taking the bibliography class, because you had to read Philip Ewell's article about Schenker and the sort of white racial frame of music theory, and that's been a hot topic lately. So I'm glad that you could encounter him here as well, and see sort of one of the ways that his music theory is deployed. But really also, I think I really like Philip Ewell's work, and I do agree with him about a lot of the things that he says. And Schenker is a really complicated figure for us in music theory. He is super important, super influential to North American music theory as you've been taught, as you have experienced it in classes and things. And he's problematic because of what is essentially like white nationalism coming through in his conception of harmony. And Beethoven is really important for Schenker. He definitely one of you asked, like, is Beethoven just like a vehicle for his theory? And that's too crass a way of putting it, I think, or too opportunistic a way of thinking about Schenker, because I think he genuinely loved Beethoven's music so much. And there's a wonderful book called Schenker's Interpretive Practice that discusses how Schenker developed his theory as not just a way to analyze this music, but as a way to like commune with the spirit of the composer, to understand what the composer was experiencing as they composed. And so, Beethoven is sort of like the prime example for Schenker, and so he's really important to Schenker's work. Could you apply some of those concepts to other music, some of you asked? And yes, you certainly could. You could use Schenkerian analysis to analyze most tonal music, and I think Chopin would be one of the later composers who you could still use Schenker's method to study. That's a personal opinion and the way I was taught it, but there are certainly people who have tried to apply it to much later music and to jazz, and there are people who have explored how it could apply to post-tonal music, although I think the verdict is that it doesn't really apply well to those things, because Schenker didn't mean for it to. He didn't like jazz. He didn't mean for it to be something that would apply to Schoenberg, because he didn't like that music. So those are things to keep in mind about him. I'm sure he will come up again in this class, and he does make an appearance, I think, later on in 518, if you take that class as well. I love that Burnham talks about how American Schenkerian theorists are like missionaries for his work, because I do think that, like I said, it had this aspect of sort of communing with a composer's kind of spirit as it manifests in a piece of music. And for me, like, I think that there is like a devotional aspect to Schenkerian analysis, and I don't even think that's always a bad thing. I think the way we talk about music a lot of the time is very devotionally oriented. So I'm not saying that to criticize him in particular, but I do think it's worth realizing that it is not like some kind of scientific objective practice. It is a very like holistic, sort of feelings oriented way of thinking about music, even as it has like rigorous ideas about like voice leading. So one of the things that's problematic about him is that he basically uses his theory to argue that Beethoven's a genius, and genius is a really complicated subject in the history of music, because it's used to gatekeep. It's used to justify keeping a lot of people out of the canon who are, basically just not heteronormative white men from Europe from these like couple of centuries. So I think it's worth thinking about how his theory has impacted that concept and been used to justify exclusionary practices. So, and then Rayti's the last one. Rayti often kind of, I don't know, I feel like he gets a little bit of short shrift in the history of theory. We don't often sort of talk about a lot of his stuff because it didn't, in some ways we don't use it. I'm not saying we like threw it all out and that it actually wasn't impactful, but it's not something that we tend to use when we teach as much. And he's well known for analyzing motive. So he has a reading of that piece that has to do with motivic cells. So I think one of the important takeaways from this article is that we use Schenker now, or excuse me, not Schenker. We use Beethoven to like measure all music that happened after him. Like the way we listen to Beethoven is the way that we listen to all music ever since, which is to say that we hear ourselves as the subject of the story. When I say subject, I mean like we project ourselves onto the narrative, and we hear, you know, not just that there's like a sense of triumph in the piece, but it's like that we're triumphing. And so that's really important as we talk more about tonal music, to keep that in mind, that like how do you project yourself onto this music. And the reason that you do that is partly because of how Beethoven has been talked about and theorized and received ever since he was alive. And so, you know, like Burnham toward the end of the chapter says, he quotes Gary Taylor's book, Reinventing Shakespeare, that each age is seen to appropriate the great artist for its own ideological ends. And Beethoven is certainly that way. In terms of projecting yourself onto the narrative, I wanted to read you a brief excerpt from Roger Ebert's 1997 review of The Empire Strikes Back. So Roger Ebert, whose reviews, if you're not familiar with them, he has passed away, but he was a film critic, and he and Gene Siskel used to have a show called like At the Movies or something like that, where they would review movies, and it was just wonderful. And he's a wonderful writer, and you can look at like it's really great to look at a review where he just tears a movie apart, because he's so funny but and incisive. But also when he really loves a movie and thinks it has some kind of merit, then his reviews are really great too. And he's so not a snob. Like he'll review anything, and he doesn't think that like kind of art films are the only valuable kinds of movies or good movies. So I just want to read the end of this to you, and I will link this as well, so that you can look at the whole review if you want to. I'm assuming that most of you have at least heard of The Empire Strikes Back, if not seen it, but I'm talking about, of course, Star Wars Episode 5, so the middle one with the ice planet, and cloud ends with the Cloud City, and so on. Okay. In the glory days of science fiction, critics wrote about the quote-unquote sense of wonder. That's what The Empire Strikes Back creates in us. Like a lot of traditional science fiction, it isn't psychologically complex or even very interested in personalities, aside from some obvious character traits. That's because the characters are not themselves, they are us. We are looking out through their eyes instead of into them, as we would in more serious drama. We are on a quest, on a journey, on a mythological expedition. The story elements in the Star Wars trilogy are as deep and universal as storytelling itself. Watching these movies, we're in a receptive state like that of a child. Our eyes and ears are open, we're paying attention, and we are amazed. And I think that's kind of the same type of thing that's happening. We see ourselves in these characters, so it's us that's going on the adventure. And we're not worried about Napoleon, you know? We're worried about our experience as it's being kind of expressed musically, or as it resonates with our feelings throughout this sonata. It's us, we're the ones going on the journey, like that's how we hear it. And I love this interpretation because it explains how these theorists like mapped on their own expectations and their own needs and wants and feelings onto this music so that it could do what they wanted it to do, because that's probably how they really heard it. So that's my response to your discussion and just a little bit more overview about Beethoven Hero. And I'll be back with more analysis videos this week. Bye for now.